drink. Okay, so let's go. Okay, good evening, everyone. I think we are live. Good to see you all. On time, even a little early. So welcome to my first live stream of the 2018-2019 school year. It's great to be here. So I really enjoy this format. It's lots of fun, and we get to be a little bit live and personal here. So you can see my house behind me. If we're lucky, my kitties, I can see them actually in the background there, will come up and visit during the live stream. So let's go. Usually what I do is go ahead and just mostly open the ground to you guys for asking questions. Hold on, I'm just going to make sure that wasn't anything urgent about my... Okay. So if there aren't any specific questions, I'll just mention a little bit more about the test. Just make sure that you are aware that there are going to be those multiple choice questions. Hold on just one moment. Am I not on? Oh, okay, nothing sound. Okay, that's weird. I'm seeing myself. Okay, stop streaming. Okay, hold on. It says I'm live, stream health. Okay, I'm going to get off the phone. Okay, bye. Okay. Sorry about that, folks. First time back, some technical issues. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and start reading your questions. So, Rayon, I like that, Rayon the crayon, love that. Okay, for negative feedback loops, for the diagrams we have to draw tomorrow, we're talking about our body temperature and sweating and coming back be okay. Yeah, that's actually fine. I'll accept anything that's, reasonably related to our unit. So, most of it, of course, is about ecology or climate change or something like that. But we did talk about homeostasis. So if you want to relate it to homeostasis, good on me, right? Just be accurate and make sure you do include, intend, all the connections, responses, mechanisms, right? Make sure you're including all that. Joy, what is kin selection? That's not something you need to worry about for this test. That's a term that refers to evolution. Kin is like your relatives, so it has to do with natural selection involving selection for your relatives rather than yourself, but you don't need to know that. Okay, good. Thanks, Daniel. Yeah, I think maybe just a few people couldn't see me. Niti, I don't know who you are, but hello. Geological carbon cycle. It's a long, I sometimes just say the rock cycle, but the idea is that's part of the very slow carbon cycle. If you want to learn more about it, actually Dr. Schrag has a great section on that in his video. I don't really include it anymore because it's not relevant to the sort of main issues around climate change, but it has to do with the idea that carbon moves through the geology of the Earth in this very long-term way over millions and millions of years. So if you're studying about the way the whole Earth works, it's significant. But in terms of our current issues with climate change, it's not really relevant to us. It's just too long-term. Okay, so you don't need to worry about that for purposes of the exam. Hi, Ronit. I have a question. Can you explain how the carbon cycle relates to the water cycle? That's an interesting question. That one I have to ponder for a moment. I mean, there's a lot of ways in which carbon relates to water in the sense of that both of those things are going in and out of living things a lot. The cycles themselves, I can't think of like an immediate specific interaction except for the fact that there's like weathering of carbon when the water goes into hits the rocks and goes back into waterways and things like that, and that the water helps to form the rocks. So there are connections like that, but they're not really relevant, again, to anything that we learned. The most relevant thing would be the idea that more of a connection between water and energy. So I talked about this idea that in order for us to have a water supply, it actually requires a lot of energy, which we still mostly get from burning fossil fuels. So, literally moving the water around, cleaning it, cleaning the wastewater, all that, transporting it. So that all requires a lot of energy, mostly from fossil fuels. Likewise, if we want to produce electricity, power plants actually use a lot of water. Okay, so there's a lot of water and energy connections. So I've mentioned in class a few times this idea that if we conserve water, we conserve energy. If we conserve energy, we conserve water. So there's a connection that way. But the actual physical cycles, yeah, there's some connections, but they're not particularly important for us right now. Bob L. I'm not sure who that is. You told us to be thorough in our FRQ, so do we need to completely explain about greenhouse gases, about like molecules re-emitting heat, or just say that they act like a blanket? I would say to the extent that you explain it, I'm going to ask you to avoid things like it acts like a blanket. It actually doesn't at all. It's not solid, right? There's molecules in the air. The first way that you said it is closer. So literally, as the heat energy hits the individual molecules, they briefly absorb a little bit of that energy and then re-emit it. In all directions, actually, but some of it goes back towards the Earth, some of it goes out into space. So I would say it depends. If you're doing the diagram, remember I said that when you do your diagrams, your descriptions can be much more concise, right? Because you're trying to fit it in a diagram. So you're not going to go into a tremendous amount of detail about how the greenhouse effect works. And for the purposes of your FRQ, you need enough to clearly connect the greenhouse effect to the other parts of your answer, okay? So I'm not going to give you several sentences because I don't want you to just copy what I say. I want you to come up with your own description. But I would say make sure that you have a smooth few sentences that connects the idea of what's happening in the greenhouse effect, clearly connects that to the impact, the problem of global warming, okay? So I think you're going to want to make clear connections between the greenhouse gases, what's happening to cause heat to remain on Earth and therefore cause global warming, right? And then connect that to the rest of the question. All right, hope that's helpful. What is the difference between photosynthesis and cellular respiration, and how are they related to each other? So that's kind of a big question. I'll try to summarize it. So photosynthesis and cellular respiration are both series of chemical pathways in living things, okay? They're both what we would call part of our metabolism, metabolic processes, chemical pathways. That just means that living things are doing a series of chemical reactions to accomplish some goal. In this case, photosynthesis, you are taking the energy from the sun, the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and going through a long series of chemical reactions, and water, of course, in order to store energy, chemical energy, in the form of molecules of glucose. And you're also fixing that carbon and actually storing the carbon as well in a way in the glucose. And now you can use both the glucose and the energy it contains inside of that living thing, right? Cellular respiration, we sometimes casually refer to, by the way, here's my kitty, she's beautiful. Her name is Penny, although I usually just call her Girl, and she's very sweet. She wants to sit on my lap right now. So anyway, where was I? Cellular respiration. So with cellular respiration, we often say it's the opposite. That's not really true, okay? It happens in a different place in the cell. It's a different series of chemical reactions, different enzymes. We'll learn about that soon. And the purpose of it is very different. It's to basically release the energy from the glucose molecules by breaking them down, releasing the carbon as carbon dioxide, the water out, and to use that energy to, in a separate reaction, synthesize ATP, right? Which is allowing us to directly use that energy to do things like move and build molecules. And we'll be hitting that pretty hard in our next unit, okay? So that's it. What are two examples of metabolism and... Hold on, I just lost your question. Hold on just one second. I got to find your question. Ooh, stuff's coming in really fast, so I'm going to try to move faster. I see a couple about metabolism. So I just mentioned that photosynthesis and cellular respiration are both metabolic processes. They're not both part of our metabolism, of course, because we don't do photosynthesis. Homeostasis is completely different. Please refer back to your stability. The stability and change language guide, and it gives you a pretty extensive description of how metabolism and homeostasis are related. So I'm going to punt that question for now. Metabolism isn't always required for homeostasis. That was a question on your practice quiz. It was a question on the actual ecology quiz that a lot of people missed, even though it was on your practice quiz. So please refer back again to the language guide for a good explanation of that. Abdullah, I'm not going to do any more on cellular respiration right now. We're going to be learning about that at much greater length in our next unit. Actually, honestly, not even at much greater length because it is a freshman biology class. You could spend a lot of time. If you're truly fascinated, I recommend that you scroll down on my BioLerner video page and you could actually see a video where I'm showing the entire process of cellular respiration in way more detail than you ever wanted to know. Okay, so feel free to check that out. Larry, what are the characteristics of life? I'm not going to sit here and make a list because you can turn to a page in your textbook faster than I can say it. But really the important part is not for me to list what they are. It's for me to point out that I'm not going to ask you for a list. I'm not going to say, hey, list these. I'm not going to have a multiple choice question where I list them. That's just not what we care about. Certainly not what I care about. I want you to understand the concept. Why do we have a list like that? Because it's helpful for us to know what it means to be alive, to either evaluate things that are alive, to compare things that are alive, right? So as much as I have a question on characteristics of life, and I think there is at least one, it's going to have the concept in context, perhaps of a specific organism, or in context of what that means. Okay, so feel like you have enough understanding of it that you could apply it to a particular scenario, and particularly the parts that are harder for people, like metabolism and homeostasis. Adat, can we use a loop you taught us in class or one of the worksheets? Any or all of the above. I'm leaving it open to you what feedback you show. It does need to be related to the unit we just learned, right? So nothing about like the economy, okay? You need to use one that is related to something that we did in class, okay? Sindhu, what are the 5 pathways that carbon can take up next after being converted to glucose? Okay, so again, I'm not going to ponder and come up with that list. I'm going to refer you. I posted the key to those review questions on School Loop. I believe that is in the climate change folder. So I'm going to go ahead and refer you to that. And if you missed some of them, make a point of putting that on your study guide, right, so that you can review that and think about what would have helped you to think in all those different directions. That's a challenging question because you have to think flexibly. That's going to be super important in our next unit on cell biology to know all those pathways. Okay, so use that as kind of a review and a preview. Raymond, can you please explain metabolism? So I'll try not to be textbooky, so you remember the sort of textbooky definition is that it is all the chemical reactions in living things that put together molecules and take molecules apart. In our next unit, you'll learn more about that, about the idea that enzymes make that happen. For our purposes now, you should have a general idea of what that involves. So, for example, photosynthesis involves putting molecules of glucose together, right, from various raw materials, so that's a form of metabolism. Cellular respiration takes apart molecules to release energy and et cetera, et cetera. So that is a form of metabolism. Other things in our body, the reactions that help to digest our food, that's a part of our metabolism, breaking molecules apart. We put molecules together every time we build muscle, build DNA, build cell membranes. Anything that we're building together by making chemical reactions happen is part of our metabolism, okay? Building proteins, etc. Anika, can you recap the water cycle? I'm not sure what you mean. If I hear the water cycle, I think you mean the natural water cycle, right? So the natural water cycle is going to be just straight evaporation, condensation, precipitation, some waterway until it gets evaporated again. You may be referring to all of waterways. I think I might ask you to ask a more specific question so that I don't sort of have to digress and talk about a whole lot of different things, okay? So if you're curious about waterways, why don't you go ahead and ask a more specific question. Negative and positive feedback. So the key thing to remember there, and again, I'm going to refer back to a specific resource, Feedback and Homeostasis. It gives great examples, breaks everything down. Okay, but again, if I want to give a 30-second answer, I'll say that negative is when you typically have some condition, and that condition becomes higher or lower. When it becomes higher or lower, let's say higher for now, that causes some response to happen inside the living thing, right? Or potentially on the earth. But if we're talking about living things, the living thing would respond in some way that actually causes that condition to become lower again. In other words, go in the opposite direction. It was going higher, response, some mechanism, by some mechanism meaning how it works, brings that condition back down again. Okay, so it's negative because it goes up, opposite direction, back down. Positive feedback, as it goes up, there's some response by that living thing or that system, if it's the earth, that the act of it going up actually causes a response and a mechanism that causes it to go up more, right? So that the action of it actually reinforces itself, right? You get this self-reinforcing loop that occurs over and over, causing whatever condition it was or whatever action it was to become more and more and more, to intensify, right? So that's the basic idea of positive and negative. So Abdullah's asking about how does global warming have a positive feedback loop? So the way you phrase that is a little bit awkward. Global warming itself doesn't have a positive feedback loop, but there are a number of feedback loops in the way that the climate works that as global warming occurs, cause the problem of global warming to increase more and more and more and more, right? So, we talked about, for example, deforestation today, or not deforestation, wildfires. So this idea that the earth is getting warmer, and I'm just going to go quickly through it, that causes an increase in wildfires, which, because it releases carbon dioxide via the greenhouse effect, keeps causing the earth to get warmer. More and more and more and more, self-reinforcing. Okay? Ria's asking about the two physical effects of global warming. B, Earth's temperature is rising, the melting of the snowpacks. Okay, so two responses to that, Ria. First of all, again, please check the key for the review that question is from. Apparently my use of physical effects is confusing a lot of people, but I meant two sort of more direct effects. Okay, well, that's poorly phrased. The idea is that the two physical changes in the ocean that I meant to talk about were the warming and the pH change. Okay, and I need to double check my wording on there because I'm getting a lot of questions on that. So I'm going to pause for a second and write myself a note. Good practice to remember things. Okay. Okay, so for the question under 4D, what criteria can we use to judge climate science? Is it relating to us personally, the IPCC peer review, or something else? All of the above, Joy. So the idea is that as a scientific community, as a world community, we use the processes of peer review, and specifically for climate science, the IPCC, to allow us to judge that things that people say about the climate, especially scientific things, have actually been checked, reviewed, judged to be reasonable by the scientific community before they can be published in a scientific journal or by the IPCC. But you personally can also use that, right? Because you can check that sources that you are using to get information are in peer-reviewed journals or referred to, referenced in peer-reviewed journals, right? So that you can know that you can judge, that you can trust that source, and you can use that to judge that source, right? So that's a personal connection to you. Serby, hello. Not sure who you are, but welcome to our live stream. Why is it hard to come to worldwide consensus? Oh my gosh. Wow, we could spend a long time on that one. I don't know. There's a lot of people in the world with different interests and different backgrounds who don't all agree. I don't have a great answer for that. I wish it was a lot easier. But, in all seriousness, there are a lot of what we would call stakeholders, right? A lot of people with different interests. You'd think we all have something in common, which is to keep the world a livable place. I would like to start there. That's my personal opinion, right? That we actually all are on the same side here. But there's a lot of people who have interests that maybe in the short term conflict with that, right? Or maybe they don't have the knowledge, or maybe they just don't want to deal with it. There's all kinds of reasons why that's not happening. Some people are very concerned that it's unfair, right? That they're being asked to, for example, contribute to solving a problem that they don't feel that they caused, right? Or they don't like the solutions being proposed to that problem. So, the good news is that most of the world community has agreed that this is a problem, that we should do something about it. That happened at the Paris Climate Agreement, right? So that's a super positive thing. It's much harder to get everybody to agree on what they're going to do about it. So that's where a lot of the issue is now. Now, remember that in the United States, there's still a lot of political issues around even accepting that this is reality, right? And I will keep reinforcing it, that is a political issue in the United States. Most parts of the world that's not even a thing. Like, they don't even understand why that's a thing here. Most parts of the world are like, well, of course this is a problem. What are we going to do about it? Right? So that's, a very brief, without me going on a long rant about that problem. Can you explain the fast and the slow cycles and how they connect? So, Sriya, again, I'll give you kind of a brief explanation of that here. So the idea is, if you go back to the way that the original carbon cycle works, right? So go back to your notes about how the carbon cycle works. Some of the pathways, because the carbon cycle represents a lot of overlapping pathways that carbon can take, right? Some of those pathways, by their nature, are very long term. If we're talking about carbon that goes from the ocean into sedimentary rock, sits underground for a long time before it gets pushed back up, that's taking millions and millions and millions of years, right? It's going to be millions of years before any of that carbon is in the atmosphere. All we really care about, not all, the main thing we care about for the problem of climate change is the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Okay, so places where the carbon is moving over millions of years and it's not getting to the atmosphere, we call that the slow cycle, right, are mostly not relevant to our problem. Okay, the fast cycle is where we would expect in a fairly short time that carbon would end up in the atmosphere, whether it was coming from living things or diffusing out of the ocean. Within a relatively short time, it's in the atmosphere. Okay, if that were just happening naturally, the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere wouldn't be changing that dramatically, and the climate itself would not change very dramatically, okay, or at least very quickly. The problem that humans are causing is we're doing things that are causing carbon that would normally stay in this very slow cycle to get released into the atmosphere, increasing that concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Okay, and the main examples we talked about were burning fossil fuels, where that carbon would have stayed underground for a really, really long time, or burning down an entire forest, where a lot of carbon would have stayed in the forest for a long time. Or potentially warming the earth enough that permafrost is melting, right? In which case we're potentially releasing a tremendous amount of carbon from frozen soil, from pools of methane, etc. Okay, places where it would have stayed in the slow cycle for a long time, right? And we're releasing it into the atmosphere, raising that concentration of carbon molecules in the atmosphere, and therefore connecting to the greenhouse effect and global warming. Hi, Marcella. For part B of the FRQ, can I talk about thermal expansion, flooding cities, and destroying habitats? What you need to do is whatever you decide to talk about, because again, I don't want to sort of like tell you exactly what to say, but whatever examples you decide to use, you need to connect them specifically to impacts on humans. How is that affecting human beings on Earth, right? And to biodiversity. And you could certainly use the term like habitat, make it clear, of course, that those habitats are supporting biodiversity, right? So make it clear, how is it actually affecting humans, and how is it affecting other species on Earth, biodiversity. Let's see, Jenna. Can you explain biomagnification and bioaccumulation? I can, Jenna, just for your information, my students are like, huh, because that's actually not on my test. Not that I don't think it's important. I used to teach it, and I've just been trying to trim down my curriculum, but I know that some of the other biology teachers covered it. It is an interesting problem, so I'll give you, again, I'll try to keep it to like a very brief explanation. You want to connect this back to the idea of food chains and food pyramids, okay? So as you go up the food chain from producer to primary consumer to secondary consumer to tertiary consumer, that's up the food chain, if you have various kind of pollutants, so for example, DDT was a famous example. I used to talk about mercury because it's a problem in the San Francisco Bay, and there's a lot of mercury, unfortunately, in our atmosphere that have come from burning coal and various other sources. So what happens, so I'm just going to use mercury as an example, is that mercury works its way into sort of the bottom of the food chain, right? It works its way into producers and primary consumers, okay? Now the problem is once living things get consumers in their bodies, and I'm going to use animals as an example here, you can't get it out of your body very quickly. So it literally starts to accumulate, build up, right? So maybe at first I'm a consumer and I'm eating something and that something has a little bit of mercury, but I'm eating it more and more, year after year of my life, right? Or month after month, depending on how long my life is. So as I eat, let's say, meal after meal, I'm getting more and more mercury in my body, and it stays there. It accumulates. I can't get rid of it very well, right? So I'm gradually building up more and more, okay, in my own body. Now, say I'm a primary consumer, and I've built up this amount of mercury, right? So say the primary consumer, I'm going to use my hand here, has this much mercury. Now a secondary consumer comes along, and it's eating me, so it got all my mercury here, but I'm just one single meal, right? Now it's eating another thing, and another thing, and another thing. And soon that poor secondary consumer has a whole bunch of mercury inside, and it can't get rid of it very easily, right? So now the secondary consumer has a big old pile of mercury. The tertiary consumer comes along, eats that secondary consumer, that's just one meal. Many big old piles of mercury, right? So as you go up the food chain, the things higher in the food chain get these much bigger doses of whatever the contaminant is, like mercury. Okay? It is magnified. So that's what we call biomagnification. And it's one of the reasons that when there's a contaminant like mercury or DDT, the organisms that are most likely to get poisoned and die are the ones higher up in the food chain. With DDT, it was the big birds of prey like eagles. Okay, with mercury, it can be organisms like us, but certainly animals, predator-type animals higher up in the food chain. Okay. I will make a connection to something I taught. I was already starting to emphasize in this unit the idea that large predators are at specific risk, right? They're more likely to be hunted, they need more resources, and therefore more likely to suffer from habitat loss and to actually die. There's fewer of them, it's easier to wipe them out, and they suffer from biomagnification. We're going to come back to that idea in evolution, right? Because understanding these relationships helps us to understand why it is that these large animals are more likely to go extinct than many other kinds of organisms. There's actually more reasons. They got a lot of strikes against them. And we'll come back to that later this year. Okay? What is a trophic cascade? Okay, so trophic refers to the question I just answered. All those levels of like producer, primary consumer, secondary consumer, tertiary consumer. The technical name for that is called trophic levels. Okay? Feeding levels. So a trophic cascade, if you know the term, think about water. When we call a water a cascade, it's when the water is going cascading down the rocks, right? Down, 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 down. In biology, when we use that word, or in science or something like that, in something technical in general, a cascade refers to kind of like a series of events where one follows the next. So this happens, then this happens, then this happens, and this happens. I'm actually going to bring up this concept in our next unit to talk about chemical pathways. And, you know, this idea that the first thing happens and then you sort of have this cascade of events after that. It's like you knock down one domino and the rest of the dominoes fall. That's the idea. So a trophic cascade is when something happens at one trophic level, but the effects cascade down to the other trophic levels. So I think in most of the bio classes, people watched the video about how the wolves changed the trees or something like that, right? That was an example of a trophic cascade, that by changing something about the wolves, you end up changing things at all these different trophic levels, right? So that's an example of a trophic cascade. Daniel, for feedback loops, do we have to draw pluses and minuses? Actually, I don't really care for that. I know that people are doing that because you saw that on one of the handouts. I actually find it kind of confusing. If it helps you to keep it straight, do that. But it's not necessary. Your written descriptions, should clarify whether the effect is positive or negative. If I can't tell whether it's positive or negative, you kind of have a problem, right? So you're going to have a space on the paper for the positive feedback and the negative feedback. So your example should be self-evident, right, to show whether that is positive or negative. So I don't particularly need or want for you to have plus and minus signs. Okay, so Rayon, I just answered your question about why Mr. Jones talks about biomagnification, and you heard my description there. Raymond, and by the way, I know I'm behind on the chat, so just bear with me if you asked a question. I'll get to it as soon as I can. Raymond, are we allowed to make our own feedback loops, or will you give us prompts? No, you are making your own from scratch. Have some ready in your mind. In fact, I would practice tonight. Nikhil, could you explain the difference between climate change and global warming? Okay, again, I'm always going to continually send you back to some resources for additional information. So you would find that on the Carbon Cycle and Climate Change debrief, right, where I actually spelled out both your handout and the PowerPoint, where I spelled out the connections between the greenhouse effect, global warming, and climate change. Okay, it's a causal connection. Each term causes the next, right? So because of rising levels of carbon dioxide, we are increasing the greenhouse effect, which is causing the problem of global warming, increasing the average global temperature on Earth. That's kind of what we mean by global warming. And global warming is causing all of those other effects we call climate change. So remember about direct effects and indirect effects, right? Climate change is a big catch-all term for all these changes happening on Earth. They don't need to be directly connected to weather, because of course weather and climate aren't the same thing, right? I see that a few people retracted their messages. I'm assuming that's because I talked about it, so thank you. That helps me to be more efficient. Thanks, Joy. Yeah, sometimes you guys respond to each other, which is helpful. Sometimes I don't see it, so I'll try to occasionally scan ahead. Okay, Daniel, I already talked about slow and fast cycles. Long-term effects of climate change. I guess that depends, Nathan, on how long-term you mean, right? Do you mean 100 years, 1,000 years? And of course, it is somewhat hard for us to predict exactly what those are. We can predict a lot. Like, we know the sea level is going to rise pretty substantially. We don't know exactly how fast that will happen, right? We know that natural disasters, certain types, will continue to increase. We don't know exactly how much or when, right? In terms of really long term, honestly, a lot of that has to do with us. What the IPCC does is it provides, and this is interesting if you want to look this up, it provides projections at different levels. I think there's like 3 levels. One is sort of like an optimistic one, like, man, we get it together really soon, okay? And then these are their projections of what would happen in the world. One is that we do a little bit, right, to make it better, to mitigate. And this is that projection. There might be one for us not doing anything at all, and the projections, start to look worse, right? And then there's even, I think, a projection for like if we actually got worse, like we started emitting more carbon emissions or something like that. At any rate, they have a range of projections that reflect possible human response, right? But because that's this huge unknown, and that's going to impact what happens in the future a lot, we can't predict. I don't know how humans are going to respond to this problem, right? And we also don't know exactly how some of these feedback loops are going to play out, right? Will they accelerate slowly, more quickly? Will they interact with other feedback loops? We're not really sure, right? So scientists are working very hard to constantly update all of these projections so that we have a better idea of what we're dealing with, but it's going to be a work in progress for quite some time. Okay, hi Ryan, glad you made it in. Can you explain J and S curves and population growth? Yeah, I'll be honest, I don't use those terms a bunch. I just find it easier to use the more descriptive terms. So for the J curve, that's exponential growth, right? So the key for that is that for organisms to be able to keep reproducing in an accelerating way for any significant amount of time, they have to have a lot of resources. So where do we see this? Well, if we put bacteria or some other organism like in a jar with a whole lot of like resources and keep adding resources, yeah, they're going to keep reproducing until they like run out of space. Like they'll just keep reproducing. So, but of course, in real life, eventually something's going to happen. The sort of easiest scenario is that something makes it level off without some dramatic fall, and then you might see that S curve, that more logistic growth curve, right? It's probably never going to be that perfect. Generally speaking, you're going to have some overshoot, right? And then organisms are going to sort of probably fluctuate, and then potentially have overshoot again, or maybe drop more dramatically if they really used up their resources all at once, right? So it's going to depend on the situation, but for any type of population growth that's growing very dramatically, like exponential, it's going to require a lot of resources, okay? And when the resources start to run out, that growth isn't going to happen anymore. Will both of the questions be on School Loop be asked on the test, or is it only one? Nope, both of them. They're on the back page of the test. I can see it in my mind. You're going to have a space for your 2 feedback loops and a space for your short answer. That's what you got. Thank you, Joy. I think my kitties are cute too. Appreciate that. Hopefully the other one will come along. He was here before we started, but he went away somewhere. I'm just going to peek around real quick. Oh, he's on the floor. Would you like to? Oh, he's walking toward me. Would you like to come over here and say hello? Come here. This is Pinky. Although, again, I tend not to call him Pinky. I, for some reason, call him Boy. Those are terrible names, I know. But his name is Pinky. I do like the name Pinky. Come on, don't just meow. Come up here so I can show you off. He's going to walk around my feet for a while and think about it. We'll see if he actually comes up here. Okay? Come on, come on. He's thinking about it. Okay, well, I'll keep answering questions while he thinks about it. What does it mean for solar energy to be converted into heat energy? Oh, here we go. Kitty break, kitty break. This is Pinky. Isn't he cute? So Pinky and Penny are actually siblings. They're littermates, so they were born together. Although I didn't get them till they were about 5. They were born in a vacant lot somewhere in San Jose. So this is a much nicer place to live. Pinky, say hello. Pinky doesn't care to say hello. Anyway, that's my other kitty. I just have 2. A small population. So, let's see here. Where were we? And a banana. What does it mean for solar energy to be converted into heat energy? So solar energy is a term that we use when we think about things like solar panels. But what, of course, you mean is light energy, right? So, you know, there are different wavelengths. And I always worry when I talk about this because I don't have a great background in physics that I probably am saying this terribly incorrectly. But I'll do the best I can. There are wavelengths, right, of radiation. So there's UV radiation, which is like the visible light that we can see. And I think some of it we can't see. And then other different wavelengths are going to be things like heat energy, and there's a whole bunch of other kinds that I can't remember right now. So, and these different wavelengths of energy have different properties, so, and they can be converted one to another in some cases. So in the case of light energy, when it hits objects, say the Earth, those wavelengths can change. And some wavelengths might still be in the visible spectrum, and they might bounce off as light energy that we can see in different colors, right? And other wavelengths might have changed to shorter or longer wavelengths and be something different, in this case heat, which we also call infrared radiation, okay, or thermal energy. So when light hits the Earth, some UV light bounces off, and that literally is part of what allows us to see things, right? Things are different colors because they absorb some of those wavelengths, right? So we talk about how plants absorb all the wavelengths except for green. A lot of green bounces off, which is why plants look green to us, okay? So some of those wavelengths bounce off as heat. We don't see that, but that is what is warming our atmosphere, and it is what reflects off of the greenhouse gas molecules. Whew. So, physicists, I apologize if that wasn't a great explanation. Hi, Colin. Are we going to have to know the details about the Paris Agreement, what it means, what countries signed it? I mean, not super details that I didn't go over in class. You know, I wanted you to have a general understanding of what's going on in the world. I will be perfectly honest, I can't remember if I put that in a question or not. But, you know, you should have a concept that because this is a global problem, that we have to have many countries working together to solve it. That's just how it is, or we're not going to be able to very effectively solve it. So there have actually been a series of agreements, not just the Paris one. That's just kind of the biggest one recently. I think one's coming up in December in Poland. So the Paris Agreement is well known right now because it was the first time that countries everybody actually sat down and agreed there was a problem. And you wouldn't think that would take us decades to get to that, but it did. So again, at the moment, the countries made mostly voluntary agreements about what they would do, but they agreed that in the future, we promise we're going to actually commit to this. That's as far as we got, and that was considered a major achievement. So I would say, for purposes of the exam, know the general concept that there are these global meetings and potentially global agreements that were in the middle of this process, right? That the U.S. is kind of waffling on at the moment, right? But that there's a lot of global political issues around trying to address climate change. Okay, and that's completely sufficient for the exam. How do plants affect the fluctuation of the Keeling curve? Yeah, I kind of let that go a little bit this year. Hold on. Okay, I don't know what's that. Anyway, I don't know what that is. Oh, the relationship between plants and the Keeling curve. So, sorry, you guys. Wow, I've fallen kind of behind here. Ooh, I'll keep trying to move faster. Maybe try to pause just a little bit on the chat here. Wow. Hold on. I'm still navigating back to where we were. Doo-dee-doo. Okay, definitely got to work faster. Okay, and I see that you've answered some of these as well. Yeah, thank you guys for answering each other's questions. That's helpful. Oh my gosh. I am way, way behind. Okay. Okay, yeah, not hugely important. The connection between plants and the Keeling curve is it's the fact that all the plants on Earth have seasonal fluctuations in absorbing carbon dioxide in terms of like when they grow, right? So that is what causes the Keeling curve to go up and down. That's kind of all you need to know right now. So I think I'm going to try to be a bit more brief because I'm seeing how far behind I am on the chat. Okay, thank you for your compliments on the kitties. I honestly don't get the question about the potential impacts of climate on humanity and biodiversity. Okay, I went over that a few minutes ago, but I'll briefly say it because it's important for the exam. The idea would be you would want, I think I said 2 sentences total, so you're going to want to have a sentence on the impacts of climate change on humanity. That means how will climate change affect humans? Humanity is just a word that means all humans, right? So how is it going to affect humans and our lives, right? It's going to, and I want to know that you understand that. And then biodiversity would be how does it affect other species besides humans, right? So a specific example of each. Okay, I hope that's helpful. Oh no, the kitties are fighting. Okay, hopefully they won't hurt each other. What are 5 ways carbon can move or go? Again, Ryan, I'm going to refer you back to the review key that is posted online. When carbon dioxide reacts with water molecules, simply it makes carbonic acid. That's what's causing the ocean to be more acidic. All you need for now. Ronit asking about how sunlight becomes heat. Again, it doesn't really become heat. I'm going to refer you back to the previous description of light energy and heat energy. Yeah, you don't need to have chemical reactions for that. It's the wavelengths of light changing in some way that I don't have good skills at explaining to you right now. How does species diversity help an ecosystem to survive? The idea, Pranay, is that it's kind of like backup, right? That if you only have one producer and that producer died, your ecosystem would not survive, right? Now, of course, that's almost never the case. There's usually many kinds of producers in an ecosystem, right? But that's a simple example, right? If everything was depending on one producer and that producer, say it was a tree, got a disease and they all died, the whole ecosystem would collapse, right? Now, ecosystems are generally much more complex than that, so that typically doesn't happen. But, you know, if you sort of magnify that idea, the more species you have, the more likely that any disturbance isn't going to sort of make the whole thing fall apart. Marlis, how does ocean acidification affect humans directly? Well, if you remember that short video that I showed in class, probably the main thing that we would notice would be that it would affect our food supply because we do depend quite a bit on food from the ocean. But in terms of biodiversity in the ocean, a lot. I mean, we're probably going to have a lot of extinction in the ocean, unfortunately. Potentially, there are other issues. A lot of photosynthesis actually occurs in the ocean. So if there were disturbances in that, that would be a huge problem for humans as well. So a number of reasons. Same in response to Ronit. Okay, well, hopefully my description helped. Biodiversity important. How does it affect humans? Yeah, so Joy, For why is biodiversity important? How does it affect humans? Again, I'm going to refer you back to when we did the biodiversity handout and the threats to biodiversity, and we talked about ecosystem services, all that kind of stuff about how we use biodiversity directly, right, for resources and products and medicines and enjoyment, et cetera, along with the fact that having that biodiversity is maintaining all the ecosystem services that we rely on. Okay, that's the short answer. For the short answer questions, would you like us to include evidence? I mean, look at the way the prompts are phrased. I don't think that that's directly asking for evidence. It really is more for explanation and examples, right? So you don't really need to talk about like ICE cores or anything like that, right? We're gonna accept that there is evidence for all of this, right? Because there is, and this question is more asking you to explain how it works and why we should care, which is what I want you to know as an educated citizen, right? If plants release carbon through cellular respiration, how are they helping the environment? That's a valid question, Renee. If you remember the picture of the carbon cycle that I showed you that I said was the college level, and there were all these arrows going in and out with numbers on them, the idea is that plants ultimately do more photosynthesis than respiration. So if you have a healthy forest, for example, it is ultimately absorbing more carbon than it's releasing through respiration. Okay? So there's a net gain in carbon storage. Net means overall, right? If we add all the pluses and subtract all the minuses, they're absorbing more carbon dioxide than they're releasing if it's a healthy forest, especially a forest that is growing. I'm guessing the species diversity can help as is basically a group of organisms living in their physical environment. Their niches are larger. Not quite sure what you mean by their niches are larger. Yeah, I'm not sure about that. It's just not the way the word niche is used. Can you please describe the 3 places water can go when it leaves a household? Well, let's see. When water leaves my household, I'm not sure it can go 3 places. Most of the water that leaves my household goes down a drain, and it all goes to the sewage system in the wastewater treatment plant. I can't think of any other place unless you're including outside in the household. If you're including outside, then of course it could go onto the street, and it could go down a storm drain. It could even potentially go into the ground if you had like a lawn or something, right, or a yard. That's about all I can think of. What roles do organisms play in a food web? So that's a reference to the food web vocabulary, like producers, consumers, decomposers. Okay. How does species diversity make ecosystems more resilient? Pranay, for the same reason that I described about why having more diversity makes it so that that ecosystem is less likely to collapse, right? Resilient just means having the ability to recover because you have more different species that can do things, right? Sort of like insurance, right? You've got some backup. Is there a difference between aerobic respiration and cellular respiration? I would say, without getting too technical, generally speaking, those are referring to the same thing. Okay, usually when people say cellular respiration, they mean aerobic. We will learn in our next unit how, more specifically, how some organisms can do anaerobic respiration, and usually, sometimes you'll just hear respiration, sometimes you'll hear anaerobic. I don't think cellular respiration is used to refer to that. Let's see. Why are producers the largest section in a trophic energy pyramid? They have to be. Because if they were smaller, because of the fact that you lose energy at each level, the next level up, it's physically impossible, right? It's the fact that you lose energy means that the next level up has to be smaller because it can't get all the energy from the level below. So it's sort of like it literally is physically impossible, right? This is the second law of thermodynamics. It would be impossible for the next level up to be larger because the next level up can only use a small amount of the energy in the level below it. Right? So it can only build as much biomass and have as much energy as a very small portion of the level below it. Okay, so I've already talked about that short answer question a few times. Rip V, relationship between natural and man-made water cycles. There's a whole bunch of relationships, right? I mean, we've imposed all these things on top of the natural cycles. So I would need you to ask a more specific question about that, right? Because there's a whole bunch of overlaps. If you have a waterways diagram, which I think all the classes do, you can see all these different overlaps between those two. Major impacts of climate change on the SF estuary. You asked for 2. That was probably a prompt somewhere. Off the top of my head, I don't think of it that way, right? There's many impacts. There's sea level rise. There's differences in the fresh and salt water. Going to be differences in the pH because of ocean acidification, right? So I'm not sure if you're looking at a specific prompt. Not quite sure where that came from. So there may be other things that are referred to on that prompt. Okay, good. Yeah, somebody has a good answer about the trophic levels. Nice. I think that was from Arthur. Thank you. Yeah, thank you guys. I see you chiming in there. Yeah, Rayon makes a nice point about the idea that these extreme changes that we talked about with Chippo, that even if the ecosystem is diverse and resilient, may not be able to withstand. Do clouds reflect heat or light? Okay, good question. Mostly, maybe both, but for sure light. So this is the difference between the greenhouse gases, which don't reflect light. Think about the fact that light shines right through carbon dioxide, right? Like that doesn't stop the light from getting to Earth, right? So the light goes right through things like carbon dioxide. The light can't go right through clouds, right? There are molecules in the clouds that reflect the light back out. That's why clouds create shade, because not all the light can go through. Now some can. Obviously, it doesn't become pitch dark when a cloud comes, right? But it certainly decreases the amount of light that comes through, which means ultimately it decreases the amount of heat that bounces off the Earth. Now, I'm thinking this through as I'm speaking. If the light hits the clouds, is some of that converted to heat? And probably, yeah, I would think so, because you're hitting physical molecules. So probably some of that light is converted into heat and goes off into space, and maybe, that's one of the reasons why it gets a little cooler, I would think, when a cloud covers the sun. What is an estuary? I used to teach that term a lot. I don't so much anymore, but the basic idea is an estuary is a place where fresh water, in this case from coming in the delta from the rivers in California, mixes with salt water. And it's usually fairly enclosed so that it's kind of calmer and the water is brackish. Ecologically, it's super important because lots of organisms really like those conditions. So historically, a lot of organisms would come in to the estuary and reproduce because the conditions were good for that. We've, of course, changed the conditions a lot, so that's not happening quite as much as it used to. There is coastal flooding and increased heat, loss of homes, wildfire, so those are some suggestions for impacts. The tidal mouth of a large river where the tide meets the stream. Okay, sure. I mean, the San Francisco Bay Estuary has kind of a more specific description. Oh, okay. So Daniel, it looks like you asked students to delete answered questions to help me be more efficient. I guess the downside of that is that this chat is being recorded, so if you want those on for the future. I guess that being said, if it's really a repeat, it's probably not that helpful in the future anyway. So yeah, feel free to retract a question if you feel like it's very similar to something that's been asked and will help me to move more quickly. And actually, since I just paused from the questions, I'm realizing I messed up. I didn't plug in my power cord, and I thought it would last, but it's starting to run out. So I'm going to take about 30 seconds and run and get my power cord. It's almost 9, but I'm actually happy to keep going. I do usually end up running longer than an hour. So I will just take a quick 30-second break and grab my power cord, and I will be right back. Okay, so back. I am being powered with electricity again, which I am proud to say is coming from renewable energy sources. Moving on. Okay, I got another question about metabolism and homeostasis. I'll repeat that there's a really nice description of that on the Stability and Change language guide, so I'm going to punt to that one for now as well. Can we have a lot of mechanisms in our feedback loops? I mean, I would say include the most critical ones. Like, don't go crazy, right? As long as you have clear connections and they make sense and you've hit the most important points, that's fine. Which of the following releases carbon to the atmosphere? Burning trees or cutting trees? Both of them. I mean, ultimately, it's going to go away. It's going to go into the atmosphere. The carbon will go into the atmosphere. It can go very quickly if you burn the trees. If you literally left them on the ground to rot, it would just take a while because the entire process of decomposition would have to occur. So, but usually if people want the land, they don't just let them sit there, right? They either take them away and use them, in which case potentially they could stay in the wood for a while. But like I said, a lot of times they do just burn them. Okay, I already talked about biomagnification. Does the greenhouse effect keep the Earth warm by the atmosphere, allowing solar energy to pass? No. The greenhouse effect, solar energy, light energy does come into the atmosphere, regardless of the number of greenhouse gases. Okay? The greenhouse effect keeps the Earth warm because it's stopping the heat energy. I don't want to say stop. It's reflecting more of the heat energy back to Earth instead of letting it escape into space. Okay? How do we affect climate change and global warming? Dina, I'm going to refer you back to the debrief where I talked about bad, right? How specific human activities are increasing the greenhouse gases and therefore increasing global warming and climate change. You have to burn the, okay, thank you. How does heat come from light? It doesn't come from light. It's just another form of energy. Both are based on wavelengths, okay? I don't describe potential impacts of climate change on humanity at all. Okay, I've answered that question multiple times, so I'm not going to answer it again. How does the chemical reaction where carbon dioxide diffuses into the ocean create? At this point, I'm not going to explain the chemistry of that. It's not necessary for you to know right now. You just need to understand the concept that the ocean is becoming more acidic and that that affects things in the ocean in the sense that living things need a particular range of pH to function, just like we need a particular range of temperature. So as that pH in the ocean changes pretty quickly, some organisms are not going to be able to function at the new pH. Or it's going to take a lot of their energy to maintain homeostasis in that new pH, right? Or they normally build shells and they won't be able to build shells. So there's multiple reasons why that's going to impact biodiversity in the ocean quite a bit. Okay, I'm going to start skipping a few questions that have been asked before that I've already answered. Factors to which the things respond. There's like a multiple choice question in here. I'm not going to answer that specific question. I'm not sure where that multiple choice question comes from. Yeah, I think I'm going to skip that one right now. Cutting trees are not releasing carbon dioxide, only the process of combustion. Yeah, obviously it's not the cutting itself that releases it. It's what happens to the trees after you cut them. And yes, that also means they're not doing photosynthesis. Okay, again, I'm just kind of skimming for questions that are a little bit newer. Okay, Dina's asking about ecosystem services. There's a whole bunch of examples on the different videos and resources that we've had, so just remember the general concept is that these are things that healthy ecosystems do to help humans, services for humans. So, an example would be the water cycle, right? We don't have to do anything to make that happen. Just having the earth functioning makes that happen, right? Soil forming from decomposers. So those are ecosystem services that help us out. Water cycles. What are some ways that we can put carbon back into the slow cycle? Wow, I wish we had ways like that, Christian. Unfortunately, we don't really have a lot of ways. The best way we have is letting a forest grow. That is really the only direct thing humans can do, right? There are agricultural practices that tend to build soil. That's something that people are working on. But unfortunately, most of the ways that carbon would go back into the slow cycle are, well, slow, right? That's the problem, right? If we fast forward a million years, a lot of the carbon we're putting in the atmosphere will be back in the slow cycle. That's just not going to help us in our current predicament. Would deforestation be considered moving from slow cycle to fast cycle? Yes. Can you explain about niche? I'll just try to say the basic idea of niche is it's kind of like the role, R-O-L-E, of an organism in its ecosystem, kind of its lifestyle, right? So it's really everything about the way that that organism functions in the ecosystem. So it could be related to the food chain, like its predators and its food, but it could also be things about its behavior, the fact that it comes out during the day or that it reproduces at a certain time of year. How it uses its habitat, right? Does it burrow under the ground or does it live on top of the ground, right? So all those things are part of its niche, its special little place in the world where it's not competing with other organisms, right? So it's related to the idea of specialization, and that will come up again during our evolution unit as well. Where is the methane and gases stored under the permafrost? I don't have like a very precise answer for that. I believe they're fairly deep under the frozen ice, but actually I think some of the pools are closer to the surface. It probably just depends on what happened in the past and how the organic matter got buried and what the bacteria did, right? So obviously some pools are close enough to the surface that people are worried that they're going to defrost, right, for lack of a better term. So some of them must be relatively close to the surface. I think there also are some deep in the ocean. Sustainable water. How do we, okay, I'm going to skip, yeah. So what are some examples of using water sustainably? Well, using it sustainably would probably relate back to efficiency and conservation. But we also talked about solutions for sort of increasing the possibilities for our water supply, like rainwater harvesting or recycling of water through reclamation at wastewater treatment plants or through recycling gray water in our households, right? So those are ways that we can sort of reuse the same water that we have, right? Or potentially get more fresh water through harvesting rainwater or use what we have more efficiently. So those would all sort of fall under that sustainable water. Daniel, I didn't miss your question. I did actually go on at some length about the fact that I don't feel like I want or need to have the pluses or minuses for the mechanisms. Rian, thank you so much for your answer about niches. That's helpful as well. Ria, about albedo. It's not a big point, to be honest. I didn't even put it on the vocab list. It only comes up in that feedback practice that we did about climate change. But basically, it literally means how much a surface reflects lights. So shiny things like snow have a high albedo, right? Dark, dull things like plain water have a lower albedo. And it's important in the sense of what happens, how much of that light is converted to heat energy. The physical effects of global warming, again, if you're talking about, I think I wrote that term on a handout. It seems to be really confusing to a lot of people. It's probably not even the best term, to be honest, because I was referring to temperature and pH. Technically, pH is probably a chemical effect. Don't worry about it too much. What is calcium carbonate? It's limestone, as in limestone rock. It's also what shells are primarily made of, like seashells. And the significance to us is that it's harder for organisms to form calcium carbonate when the ocean is more acidic. So organisms that have shells, like things like clams, but actually much smaller organisms as well, they tend to have thinner shells, weaker shells. It's requiring more of their energy to make them, and so some of them may not be able to survive because of this. What type of ecosystem is the SF Bay? Technically, in the water, it's an estuary. Naturally, it would be surrounded by wetlands, but not so much anymore. Marine actually refers to salty ocean water, so technically, estuaries are brackish. Why is water a renewable resource? Because it keeps coming down from the sky, right? The natural water cycle is constantly renewing water. So it is constantly renewed every second of every day, thank goodness. How is biodiversity dispersed? I think you might be talking about something that we don't cover in this class at all. There's a lot of quantitative numerical calculations that one can do about biodiversity, about how it's dispersed, spread out? Is it all concentrated together or more spread out? We didn't get into that at all. That's like something that would be covered in an AP level environmental science class, so we don't need to worry about that. Okay. Nice answer, Madeline, about the natural water cycle and sustainability. Nice answer, Kevin, about the sedimentation. Thank you. Dina, your question about a positive feedback mechanism in our internal conditions. Well, remember the key idea of feedback, right? Negative feedback leads to stability, which is why it is part of maintaining homeostasis. Positive feedback tends to lead to instability. Most living things don't want more of some condition, more extreme conditions, right? Usually the only example that people use to talk about positive feedback in living things is childbirth, right? You have more and more labor until the baby is born, okay? But generally speaking, we have negative feedback, and that's how we maintain homeostasis. Okay, Grace, just to clarify the terminology of condition and response and feedback loops, there is a bunch of specific terminology. Technically, there's a term stimulus for what makes something happen. So say that the condition would be something like my body temperature. A stimulus might be going out on a hot day or starting to exercise. My body's response would be sweating. The mechanism would be how it is that the sweating actually cools me down, in this case, the evaporation of water, right? And taking away the heat energy from my body. Okay, so that's how those terms are used. Ella, in terms of arrows and boxes, the box in negative feedback is typically put around the condition, just for clarity that, hey, this is the most important thing that we're sort of coming back to. Otherwise, in terms of where you write things, if it's a straight cause and effect, like A is causing B and you don't need to describe how A is causing B, I would just put A, arrow, B, right? Some people will draw on the arrow, like kind of what's happening, like, in the way that we would maybe draw, write the word photosynthesis or something, right? I'm not, to be honest, going to be too concerned about that. If your diagram is clear and you've written a description of the process next to the arrow instead of on the arrow, I don't really care about that too much, but it should be clear and easy to follow, okay? There probably are some specific things about that, but we're just going to let that go. Can you explain the hand in the bucket of water experiment? Okay, so Ritvi, the point of that experiment, kind of more of a demonstration really, was for you guys to really just get this visual and kinesthetic experience that there is heat coming out of you, right? I mean, really, we know that, right? You can just hold your hand a millimeter from your arm and you can feel the heat coming out of you. But the idea was to realize that when a hand moves, more heat comes out, raising the temperature of the water more. Why does more heat come out? Because in order to move your hand, your cells are performing more cellular respiration because that's providing the energy to move your hand. So as you move it, your cells start doing cellular respiration at a faster rate, and every time you do cellular respiration, you release heat automatically. So if you do more cellular respiration, you release more heat. So that movement ends up generating more heat in the water, right? So that is the mechanism by which, for example, shivering warms you up, because you're increasing the rate of cellular respiration and therefore increasing the heat that is lost, right? Which helps to warm up your body. What are some solutions that will decrease carbon emissions and help to stabilize greenhouse gases? So again, Arya, I'm going to refer you back to a resource. There was this entire PowerPoint, a big old long one called Energy and Solutions. And you answered a whole bunch of questions about energy. We spent a day in class talking through some of those solutions. There were solutions listed in all the videos, right? So I could go on for an hour about that. I'm not going to do that. But, suffice it to say that certainly some of the big ones were not burning fossil fuels, finding alternatives to that, and dealing with deforestation, like not doing that, right? But there were a whole bunch of other kinds of very specific solutions that you can get from those resources. Okay, there's a question related to waterways about how water can get to a household. Ultimately, it only gets to my household one way, which is pipes from the Santa Clara Valley Water District. Okay, now how they get it is a bigger question, right? If I have to sort of narrow it down, they have two sources, surface water and groundwater, right? Now, specific places, they could be getting their surface water from a bunch of reservoirs. They could be getting their groundwater from different aquifers. But generally speaking, they're either using surface water or groundwater, and they're sending that in pipes to my house. Okay, Navrit, can we use the examples from the feedback loop worksheet on the test? Sure, you're welcome to use those examples, but I'm going to say again that the way they were phrased on that sheet are probably not sufficient. You need to put it in your own words and put enough detail to show that you understand and that you're not just like copying 3 phrases from that worksheet. Okay? How is the small change in temperature causing so many effects, hurricanes, and other disasters? This relates to the fact, and again, you can go back to the carbon cycle and climate change debrief for this. But the reality is even a very small increase in the temperature of the ocean for something like hurricanes, for example, as the hurricanes, this is my understanding of it, as the hurricanes are moving over the ocean, they pick up some of that energy in the ocean. And even just by picking up a little more heat energy from the ocean, those hurricanes can become significantly stronger. Okay? Even just 1 degree means that more snow will fall as rain, right? Even just 1 degree is going to cause certain changes in the seasons or in habitats, right? So yes, those small changes have very, very dramatic impacts, right? We think that 2 or 3 degrees is going to be huge in terms of the amount that it's going to change conditions and life on Earth. Okay, Michael, I think your confusion about how many free response questions is related to the fact that I tend to use the term FRQ for specifically the short answer, that one about climate change, okay? The one with the feedback diagrams, I don't really call that FRQ because it's not writing. It's just another kind of open-ended question, right? So there's the 2 questions that were posted on School Loop, 1 question asking you to draw both a positive and a negative feedback loop, and then a second question with that prompt about climate change. Okay, so that's what we meant by 2. 1 about feedback loops, 1 about climate change. How does climate change affect biodiversity? I went through a few examples earlier, but I want you to think about the effects that climate change will have. Again, I'm not going to give you a very specific answer because I want you to describe this on the FRQ. But I want you to think about those effects of climate change in the ocean, on Earth, certain various conditions. How would that affect biodiversity, right? Like what would that actually do to living things? Okay, Abhi, I already answered that question about the feedback loops. Yes, you can use the example of body temperature. That's fine. It works better for negative feedback. Niche contains. Okay, another response to niche. Okay, Rana, your question, does thermal expansion cause less space in the ocean to diffuse carbon? No, it doesn't really work that way. The volume of the water in the ocean is, of course, causing sea level rise, right? Very gradual but relentless sea level rise. That doesn't cause less space. The only thing I can think of is that you're thinking the water is somehow sort of taking up more space. That doesn't directly relate to the diffusion of carbon. What causes the diffusion of carbon dioxide, and it is carbon dioxide that's diffusing, has to do with the relative concentrations of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and the ocean. So the idea of diffusion is that there are molecules of carbon dioxide up here in the atmosphere, molecules of carbon dioxide down here in the ocean. As the ocean and the atmosphere come into contact, there are constantly individual molecules of carbon dioxide moving between those 2 places. Okay, always, some going in, some going out. Depending on the concentration, there will be more molecules of carbon dioxide moving in one of those 2 directions. So, in recent years, there is a higher concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, right, than there is in the ocean. So that means at any given time, there have been a greater number of carbon dioxide molecules diffusing into the ocean than diffusing out of the ocean, okay? A faster rate of diffusion into the ocean than out of the ocean. So the ocean has been absorbing all this carbon dioxide, right, actually helping us get it out of the atmosphere. What's happening, of course, is the concentration of carbon dioxide in the ocean is increasing, right? As that happens, it becomes closer to equilibrium with the atmosphere, which means this net difference between diffusion into the ocean and diffusion out of the ocean is getting smaller, okay? The ocean is absorbing carbon dioxide at a slower rate than it used to because the concentration in the ocean is becoming not so much different from the concentration in the atmosphere, right? So we're actually going to hit this a lot more in our next unit when we talk about diffusion, but that's the basic idea. Around species diversity, yes, you're correct. The variation of species in an ecosystem. Within a species is genetic diversity. So that was a question from our review today. Why are consumers not as needed in an ecosystem? And I like how you said not as needed. You're right. It's not like we sort of don't need them at all, right? They do so to help to maintain stability. But the idea is that life literally could not exist without producers because they're bringing energy and carbon and putting it in molecules that the whole rest of life on Earth can use. Okay? Life on Earth could not exist without decomposers because very quickly all the nutrients would get locked up in dead stuff and detritus, right? And would not be available for other living things, and then everything else would eventually die, right? So life on Earth could technically exist without consumers. You could have a system in which, I think, in which there are just producers, and the producers die and decomposers eat them. But that's kind of not realistic, right? Like, there will always be organisms. If there are producers available to eat, right, organisms will evolve to eat them. So it's not really realistic that there would be no consumers. It's more of a thought experiment, so you can sort of think about these very essential functions that producers and decomposers provide for ecosystems. How we calculate population density. I feel like that's not something I emphasize anymore. I can't remember if it was still on my population worksheet. It may be for other classes, I don't remember. But it's like the density of anything else, right? I could calculate the density of some object by thinking of sort of its weight versus its mass, how much mass is sort of condensed into a certain volume, right? So if I think about population density, it's actually not much different. It's the number of organisms in a particular space. So I could talk about the population density of California, the number of people divided by the amount of space, square miles, square meters, whatever, in California. And that would be the population density, okay? How packed in the people are into that space. Why can't renewable energy sources that are intermittent not produce electricity? Okay, I think this is related to that question that was on the checkup. So what I was trying to test on that checkup is whether you understood the meaning of intermittent, okay? Intermittent means that they are not available continuously, right? Light energy, only available when the sun is out, right? Solar energy, wind energy, only when the wind is blowing, okay? The inherent problem, so we can use both of those to produce electricity. Of course we can. We just can't use them to produce electricity continuously. Because if I were depending only on solar panels, right? When the sun went out, I would have no more flow of electricity. Electricity is like live. You have to be producing it all the time, 24/7, right? So if I don't have like a whole lot of really good batteries to store energy during the day that I could then use at night and keep that electricity flowing, it wouldn't work as the only source of energy. So what we need is to have enough sources of energy and enough things like batteries for energy storage that even if we rely a lot on these intermittent sources of energy, we could still provide electricity around the clock, right? And that's one of the reasons fossil fuels are so convenient. It's because we can just keep burning them 24/7, right? So that is something that's super convenient. So we're going to have to be very flexible and have a lot of different kinds of energy sources to allow us to have enough backup to be able to keep producing electricity for everyone 24/7. Ecosystems survive through weather patterns, and if those change as quickly as climate change, organisms die. Sri, I think you're talking about this idea that if the weather changes dramatically and the climate changes dramatically and most importantly quickly, then yes, organisms can't sort of keep up very well, right? And yes, they are more likely to die off. Okay. Michael, I really hope when you wrote, can we eat the cat, that you meant, can we pet the cat? Okay, because nobody's eating my cats. Please don't even suggest that. When objects on energy enters the Earth's atmosphere as light energy, when objects on Earth absorb it, it's converted. Yeah, that's a pretty good explanation, Marlis. Thank you. Yeah, if my cats could read, I'd be in trouble. I think they can only read the containers of food. Aren't electrical cars move from electricity that is made from coal? It depends how your electricity is generated, okay? It depends on who your electricity provider is. If your electricity provider is in a place that depends on coal-fired power plants, then yes, a lot of your electricity comes from coal, and that's not so great for your electric car, right? However, if you were in a place like California, especially the Bay Area, right, a lot of our electricity is generated from renewable sources. And remember, California is raising the amount that is required to be generated from renewable sources every year, right? That's the renewable energy portfolio or standards, right? We also happen to be in a situation where we can make some selection. I pay some tiny amount more so that my personal electricity comes from all renewable sources, right? And so there is some consumer choice involved as well. And obviously, as more of us choose that, and as California requires more, we increase the overall amount that comes from renewable sources, which means that all those electric cars on the road are actually sort of getting cleaner all the time, right? So that's a really positive thing. Can you touch on carrying capacity? Yeah, I know that carrying capacity is kind of a complex topic for people. The basic idea is just this idea of how much an environment can carry, right? Like how many organisms can this environment support over time based on the resources that it has? That's really all it means. In context, it's really a hypothetical idea, right? There's no actual line out in nature, but it's an idea that helps us to understand why it is that when populations go up, that they come down. They come down because of limiting factors. But if the environment isn't changing much, if the resources aren't changing much, we do see this sort of fluctuation around the carrying capacity because that's the amount of resources that the environment typically has. If that environment is changed in some way that impacts the resources available, then we'd actually see the population kind of adjust to that, right? Maybe it would fluctuate higher or lower, maybe temporarily, maybe long term. So it's just an idea that helps us understand why and how population changes, right? Hi, Larry. Thanks for your clarification there. I probably used the wrong word. I think I meant the visible spectrum of light, not ultraviolet, so sorry about that. Again, we start to drift into physics and my brain kind of doesn't work so well. Okay, I already talked about climate change and global warming. Okay. Thank you, Marlis, about the population density thing. Ria, regarding adaptation, again, there's been lists of those in the PowerPoint. There's a couple of slides in the PowerPoint. Dr. Schrag talked about it quite a bit, strategies for adaptation. The key thing is to remember that adaptation means to the effects of climate change. It's not going to help us slow down climate change, right? It's going to help us to survive and function, okay? So maybe we're going to move the wastewater treatment plant inland. Maybe we're going to build wetlands around it to absorb the water as it rises, right? So things like that. Quick time check, it's 9:23. I'm hanging in there. I'm getting a little tired. I would say 10 would be the absolute maximum, maybe a little bit before that if I feel like I'm starting to run out of energy. Okay, so I'll continue to try to hit the most important questions that I haven't touched on yet. Thank you, Serby, for your answer about the cat. Appreciate that. Esther, will some questions from the checkups be on the test? Not necessarily those exact questions. Probably not those exact questions, because I made those up right before the checkup, right? But if I felt that they were important enough to put on a checkup, those concepts are highly likely to appear on the test, right? So if you missed a question on a checkup, that's super important. That's why I go to all the trouble of saying, you must put that on your study guide. You must staple that to your study guide, right? Because that is your best feedback about the things that you missed once already, maybe twice, right? And you don't want to miss them again. So, you know, again, maybe not those exact questions, but probably those concepts. What happens? Okay, hold on. Sorry, I got off on the chat again. Sometimes it jumps around and I can't find where I was. Yeah, and please, if you guys are tired, you know, log off. Sleep is important, right? Wow, I'm way behind. Okay, thanks, Colin, for your response about metabolism. There's a question about organisms feeding on more than one trophic level. I would say omnivores. There were a few questions about scientific investigation. That referred to the very, very first day of school when I talked about how science is a lot more than just experiments, that it's models and data and observation and argumentation. The PowerPoint I used that day is posted under biology class references. Esther is just going to end when she gets through all the questions. I'm not sure I'm going to get through all the questions. Okay. Sorry, I need to write myself a note. Okay, sorry, I'm still scanning through. There's a lot going on this chat. And I will ask you guys for future reference to try to minimize extraneous comments on the chat. It just makes it hard to manage. Okay, so try to avoid repeating things a whole bunch and doing too much outside chat. It just makes it really hard for any of us to sort of plow through all this, okay? Because I want to be able to help you. Oh, interesting. Larry is saying that the description of greenhouse effect on Wikipedia is pretty good. Yeah, there's tons of good animations for it as well. Sometimes I'll do things like I'll Google greenhouse effect animation. So if you need something or greenhouse effect, and then just go to image, and sometimes that helps people if they can see more of a visual. And then Sri is pointing out that the textbook has a really simple explanation as well. And that's all you need for our purposes, frankly, is a simple explanation. That's totally fine. Okay, water and energy. I see that one's been answered. Oh, thank you, Daniel, for the suggestion about getting people to delete their questions. Ria, is water sustainable? The way you phrase that isn't an answerable question. It's about whether our use of the water is sustainable. Currently, the answer to that is no. Larry's pointing out that you don't conserve energy by switching to renewables. That's true. That's not really conservation. It just allows us to use energy in a way that's not contributing to climate change. Okay, conservation is just using less energy. If you're talking about body temperature, you could use the specific body temperature, like 98.6 Fahrenheit or 37 degrees Celsius. Thanks for the response, Colin, about water. Dina keeps asking about the ocean. I talked about, humans depending on food from the ocean and various other resources as well. Yeah, thank you, Colin. You guys are on it. Okay, I don't think we need to know about geoengineering. Not specifically, no. It's an interesting thing, but it's not a big part of our curriculum. Okay, gonna skip all that. Devin, your response, yes, there's actually a bunch of kind of crazy sounding schemes for geoengineering. That was the one you mentioned about putting particles in the atmosphere. That was the one that Dr. Schrag talked about. Okay, Tristan, I'm gonna put you on a timeout. Okay, you need to watch your language. Okay, again, I'm just scanning for new questions here. Thank you, Daniel, although I'm proud to work with a lot of really awesome bio teachers. When the earth warms, does the process of decomposition become faster? Yes, it can. So this came up a bunch of times during class because I think there was an example on the feedback sheet about as earth becomes warmer, decomposition occurs faster. And it literally is because, the chemical reactions that living things use become faster with temperature to some extent. And also, when it's too cold, bacteria just literally can't function. They become dormant because it's sort of out of the range that they can function in. So as the temperature gets warmer, you literally have more bacteria that are just able to be active. And then what they're doing might happen faster. That's a little more complicated question that we'll get into later. Yeah, thanks, Larry, for clarifying about biotic. Anything that's produced by a living thing. Okay, we've got some extraneous comments again. If you can try to reduce that, that's super helpful. See, what I was thinking was ocean rising, glacier melt, and increasing intensity of storms due to increased condensation. Yeah, and the intensity is also due to the warming of the water. If you're thinking of hurricanes, if you're thinking of actual storms like rainstorms, then yeah, that has more to do with the increasing water vapor in the atmosphere. Okay, a lot of random extraneous stuff, you guys. Try to cut back on that. Don't just try, do that. Thank you, Daniel. I agree. Okay, I'm pausing. I'm just reading through some of your messages. Oh, Jennifer, what is DDT? It's a. I'm getting tired with DDT. It was a pesticide that was used a few decades ago, and it got sprayed all over the environment. And then it took a while for people to figure out that biomagnification was occurring, and all these eagles were dying. And so it's just the abbreviation of some big long chemical name that was, I believe, it was a pesticide. Yeah, thank you for that. That N non-point source pollution. Yeah, I don't use that abbreviation much, so I wasn't sure what you were referring to. But yes, non-point source pollution. Yeah, and the other thing is not even just that the physical pollution is all spread out, but the source in terms of who's doing it. Like literally the people are all spread out, right? So it's all the people in Cupertino that are contributing to the non-point source pollution on the street, right? Plus all different physical sources of it. So it just makes it much harder for us to solve the problem when lots of people are doing it, right? Yeah, I'm going to skip that. Yeah, NPP, right. Oh, I think I know what you're talking about. I think it's like primary production or something. Anyway, it's not, I don't remember what those initials stand for, but I don't think it's something that you need to know. It's certainly not an abbreviation that I use. Carmen's asking about biofuel. Biofuel literally just means fuel that comes from biological material, living material. The oldest biofuel on Earth is wood, humans, actually, and manure. People have been burning those things for years as a source of energy for heat, for cooking food, etc. In terms of energy and climate change, the idea would be that humans could actually come up with ways to produce biofuel efficiently, we hope, right? I think one way, for example, is to use algae that grow very fast and don't need a lot of resources, much less resources, for example, than growing plants. And that if we could grow that algae and the algae would sort of pump out molecules that we could then burn, like literally physically burn as fuel. Another example would be what happens at landfills that you saw in the video about how there's bacteria in the landfill or at wastewater treatment plants that as it's breaking down materials, as the bacteria are breaking down this organic matter, are producing methane gas that we literally can burn, like literally on fire in a little power plant, right? And use that electricity, that fuel. So that's considered biofuel. So it's a potential alternative fuel in the way that wind power or solar power are, right? It would be renewable, of course, because we can keep growing things, right? And it depends how you do it, how much of a solution it is. It could be an important solution for us to produce a sort of very dense liquid fuel, like for things like airplanes, right? Which are very hard, if not impossible, to run on batteries. So Christian's asking if we don't get enough snow during the cold season, we may be in a drought because there isn't enough water to last us through the year. Okay, that's true, Christian, but I want to clarify something. We could not be getting enough snow even if it's not a drought. We had a year, I can't remember now if it was last year or a couple years ago, where we had record-setting rain, but hardly any snow. So remember, there's two issues, the form of the precipitation and the amount, right? What we really want is lots of cold precipitation, lots of snow. Lots of rain doesn't help us much. A drought where we get nothing at all doesn't help us much, right? We want lots of snow. Forest part of the fast. Renee, about the forest being part of the fast carbon cycle, I probably would argue that individual trees are part of the fast carbon cycle, but when you're talking about a whole forest where this group of trees would be there for a very long time, now you're starting to talk more about a slow carbon cycle, or at least a carbon sink. Okay, so I'm going to clarify this one more time. I've said it 2 or 3 times already, but Clara's saying she's confused about the physical impacts on the environment and the impacts on humans. I never said the physical impacts on the environment. I said the impact on humans and biodiversity, right? So biodiversity is not physical impacts on the environment. Biodiversity means impacts on other species, living things. Okay, so hopefully that clarifies it for you. We're worried about other living things going extinct due to climate change, right? So why are we concerned that that's going to happen? What's happening that's impacting and killing off these other species? Do mushrooms decompose and emit heat? Well, yeah, anything that was alive could decompose. Now that would mean decomposers are consuming the mushrooms, right? And then as they do that, they will emit heat through whatever metabolic process they're doing, like respiration. The mushrooms, of course, themselves are decomposers, right? And as they do respiration on the thing they are decomposing, they will emit heat from cellular respiration. Okay, thanks for your response, Colin, about biotic. What is the salinity of the SFA? I don't have a number for that, but remember we use that term brackish, meaning not quite as salty as the ocean, not as fresh as fresh water. I don't know if it's like I'm sure it fluctuates. Yeah, as the tide comes in, it probably fluctuates, right? So remember that the salt's coming in from the tide. So I would imagine every time the tide comes in, it's going to change the salinity in the bay to some extent. Thanks, Arthur. Yes, that's a good description of biofuel. Okay, Erin, I already answered the question about scientific investigation. Christian, I do want to clarify about mitigation. In a way, it's trying to prevent, but it encompasses the idea that it's more like reducing the chances or reducing how bad it's going to be. It sort of encompasses the idea that we can't completely prevent lots of things, right? I can't completely prevent that I'm ever going to get a cold, but I can mitigate that risk by washing my hands frequently, by getting enough sleep, right? But it wouldn't be accurate to say that I'm preventing getting a cold, right? Because that's not going to happen. So it's the same with climate change. It's not going to happen. We can't prevent it. It's already underway. But we can mitigate it in that we can reduce the severity, the intensity of it in the future. Navrin, you're asking, is negative feedback part of metabolism? No, not specifically. Metabolism is chemical reactions. There is a connection between those two sometimes. Again, I will refer you to the Stability and Change language guide. Oh, thanks, V. Net primary productivity. Yeah, that's just a way of measuring how much producers are producing, and that's not something we're going to go into. If you're going to mention, Claire, if you're going to mention the problem of ocean acidification, then I would expect that you're going to explain why that's happening, okay, related to the carbon dioxide. You know, I talked earlier about the increase in the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and how that's diffusing into the ocean. Renee, homeostasis does not always consist of processes that are part of metabolism. Okay, there's a nice description and example of this on your practice quiz. Desertification has to do with like losing soil. Like usually if you take off trees, then the soil washes away and you end up with land that is more like a desert. There's not very good fertile soil on it. It is a really significant environmental problem, really important for humans, but we didn't talk about it a lot in class. Yeah. So, Colin, thank you for sort of describing both of those things. So there can be a connection between metabolism and homeostasis if it takes energy from the processes of metabolism to maintain homeostasis. It doesn't always take energy from the processes of metabolism to maintain homeostasis, but they could be potentially connected in that case. But you're right, they are technically two different things. Okay, thawing permafrost, releasing methane, and also allowing more organic matter to be decomposed that would have stayed buried and frozen in the permafrost. So those are going to potentially increase climate change. Okay, so Abby, I'm going to refer you back to the prompt. The prompt specifically says, in the prompt, don't talk about the slow and the fast carbon cycle. Okay, so you've got to use the prompt. If you did that, honestly, at great length, you're going to run out of time, and I'd probably mark it down because it's in the prompt. Overexploitation is a term that we use. Exploit just means to use. So it means we're using too much of something. We're implying that we're sort of destroying it by using too much of something. So hunting an organism to extinction, overfishing so that a population can't recover easily or becomes extinct, right? Those would be examples of overexploitation. Deforestation, in a way, is overexploitation, right? We might do it in such a way that the forest really can't grow back. Okay. So one thing I would suggest is notice that in this chat, there are students who are, really knowledgeable. Thank you so much for sharing that. And, perhaps you might befriend these students and study with them, or at least ask them what their strategies are, right? Use your resources. There's a question about ways to use fossil fuels sustainably. That's really not possible. You can use them sustainably. Well, you can't, because they're non-renewable. It's impossible to use something non-renewable sustainably, because you will run out, because it's non-renewable. In terms of making our environment sustainable for us, I would say no use of fossil fuels would be good. In fact, no use of fossil fuels starting 100 years ago would have been really good, right? Too late for that now. Okay, I'm seeing from a question that there's a prompt somebody's looking at about the two physical effects of global warming that are part of climate change. That's not how my prompt is worded. I think it's very unclear. So I would say talk to whoever wrote that prompt and figure out what they meant by it. Yeah, so the question about carbon capture and storage, you know, I agree that in the long term we just need to stop using fossil fuels, but we're also realistic about that that's not going to happen overnight. It's probably going to take us, a while. So in the short term, perhaps if we could at least capture some of that carbon and store it away, that'd be better than letting it all go in the atmosphere. I believe that Ariane's response about shells are biotic because they're made of cells. Actually, that's incorrect, so I do want to clarify that. Shells are not made of cells. They're just calcium carbonate. It's like a rock, okay? Just like your hair isn't made of cells. It's protein. So you don't have to be made of cells to be biotic, okay? An organism must be based on cells to be considered part of life. That's why viruses are not considered by most biologists to be alive, okay? Because we have decided somewhat arbitrarily that all living things are made of cells, okay? To be biotic, you just need to be organic matter that typically means containing carbon that was in some way produced by a living thing. I am a living thing. I produced my hair, which is made of protein, not cells. A clam is a living thing. It produced its shell, but the shell itself is made of calcium carbonate, okay, basically limestone rock. Okay, I answered a question about exponential growth earlier. Accelerated growth. The rate of growth there is increasing over time. Okay, so Anushka, so then you're asking, okay, then how do we use renewable energy sustainably? We use it at a rate at which the natural systems are providing it, right? If we only have so much solar and wind power coming in, we can only use it that fast or we're going to run out. Okay, it's the same problem with water. Now, hopefully we'll have a lot of sources of renewable energy so that we have more available to us, but ultimately we can't use more than that or it's not sustainable. We have nowhere else to get energy, right? Thanks, Larry, for that clarification. You're right. Glaciers are basically water and whatever's in the water. So glaciers are not the same as permafrost. I know we didn't get into this stuff a lot, but glaciers are these big things on top of mountains that are mostly ice, kind of like our snowpack. Permafrost is literally frozen soil. So there may be some water and ice in it, but there's a whole lot of organic matter in various forms that's in the permafrost. Stimuli is just things that make other things happen, like stimulate. Yeah, thanks, Larry. And stimuli is a term that's used in a lot of contexts. Marlis, just FYI, I've heard there's also frozen methane gas deep in the ocean, not just in the permafrost, but neither one of those is good if it's released. Okay, I'm going to go just a few more minutes here, so I'm going to try to kind of scan through. And there is a transcript of this that maybe you could skim through quickly to find topics that you're interested in. And YouTube is now recording the chat as well. Okay, Kitty just walked in front of camera. Thank you. Yes, ecosystem diversity would be things like deserts, forests, even different kinds of forests, etc. Snowpacks melting, which are our source of water and flooding. Yeah, we mostly control the flooding by having reservoirs, but yes, that's our main source of water. Jennifer, calcium carbonate is just the name of a kind of a molecule. I believe it's CaCO3, right? It's just like saying carbon dioxide is a molecule made of carbon and oxygen. Calcium carbonate is just the name of a particular molecule. It happens to be the molecule that limestone rock and things like shells are made of. Okay, nice answers to gray water, so I'm going to skip that. Oh, thanks, Larry. I just need to check out what Larry writes, and I wouldn't have to answer half of these. Appreciate that. I want to clarify this statement. It says something about global warming is just one part of climate change. No, global warming is what's causing climate change. It's not one part of it. Okay, I see some questions on mitigation, some good answers to that, so I'm going to let those go. Good description of climate versus weather. Whew. I can really see the difference this year with 5 bio classes and more people coming on. There's a lot more going on here. So maybe we can brainstorm together at some point, not tonight. If anybody has some ideas to make this more efficient, I'm happy to work with that. V, I agree with you. We're going to go to sleep pretty soon here. Yeah, it's, I generally say multitasking isn't good. If you can manage to listen to this and do something else, but keep in mind your attention is going to be scattered. So, you might want to get on early and ask your questions and then go off and do something else. Okay, again, I'm just skimming through to see if there's anything else I can answer that's kind of new. Thanks, Stella. Yeah, these cats are like super cuddly. They're super scared. If you came over, unfortunately, they would hide. But yeah, they always want to cuddle with me. They're super sweet that way. Okay. Jed, I did already describe niches, and a bunch of students replied to that as well, so I'm going to let that one go. Claire, I had a couple other students ask me about agriculture. I sent an email to Madeline, but there's a lot of connections between agriculture and climate change. We didn't get into that in great depth, but a few things we mentioned, this idea that we often clear land for agriculture, and that brings in all the problems related to deforestation. If cows are there, cows are producing a lot of methane as a result of their digestive processes. We use fossil fuels to produce synthetic fertilizer. We also use fossil fuels to provide the energy for all the big machines and things that make our food production happen. So there are a ton of connections. It's just, when we want to have this much food for this many people, there's some side effects of that, right? Methane in particular probably relates most to the cows. Okay, so try not to re-ask your question a bunch of times. I am getting to them as fast as I can. So Ella, if that description didn't help you, try to ask a more specific question, okay? Okay, Bob, I'm not sure if you're in my class or not. I would say talk to somebody who has access to these PowerPoints and resources that talk about it, right? I summarize the idea of human activities connected to global warming through the term BAD, right? Burning of fossil fuels, agriculture, deforestation. Okay, so if you need more detail than that, go ahead and check your resources. The mechanism is, of course, through the generation of greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide. Yeah, I agree. Wikipedia has decent descriptions as long as they don't get too technical for you. Anushka, I already addressed the point about anaerobic versus cellular respiration. We're going to get into that in more detail in our next unit. It's not really that important right now. So, Claire, thinking about deforestation, you want to come back to that double whammy idea, right? The idea that carbon dioxide being added to the air and the plants not taking in carbon dioxide. Decomposition can be an issue if those trees that were cut down sit around and rot. They're going to eventually, that carbon dioxide will be released. Not sure what you mean, Sid, about going over the guidelines. If you're being too vague with your two sentences, honestly, all I can say is be more specific with your two sentences, right? So practice saying it with specific terms concisely. Okay, I can't tell you exactly what those sentences are going to be. That's what I'm testing you on. I just want to clarify this because cow manure keeps getting a bad name. I will tell you, actually, most of the manure comes out, most of the methane comes out of cows when they burp, okay? Because they got all these bacteria in their many stomachs, and they're burping out methane all the time, okay? It's not really in the manure. But you're right, you don't really need to know that. Larry, I'm just curious, and you don't have to tell me this tonight. Is there a separate website called Simple Wikipedia? That's kind of a cool idea. I didn't know about it. Maybe check in with me in class and let me know about that. Carbon sinks. Yeah, those are ocean plants and soil are the main ones I can think of right at this moment, but I'm getting tired. Sinks just refers to any significant place that carbon is drawn into and stored. Those are kind of the most important ones I can think of. Okay, so I'm not really seeing new chat. The last thing I'm seeing is this discussion of cows and applies to when you say a brief description about what climate change is. Yes, if you see the prompt, you are describing both the effects that are what we call climate change. That is separate from the impacts. I will quickly clarify that. Some students were sort of confused last year because incorporated in that prompt is both the effects of climate change, like effects that we will see in the climate, like hurricanes or something, right? And impacts on humans and biodiversity. So how will those effects, those things that are happening as the climate is changing, how will that change the lives or end the lives potentially of humans or biodiversity? Okay, so effects means the effects of this process of climate change. Impacts means how does it change, how does it affect actual humans or other species? Okay, so hopefully that clarifies that question for you. Okay, thanks, Larry. I'll check that out. Simple.wikipedia, that's cool. Okay, thanks. Appreciate that. Okay, so it's 9:58, so I'm going to start to wrap up. Most important advice I can give you is go to sleep soon, right? If you've been hanging out, you're really working hard, you know a lot of stuff, right? Really just kind of focus on getting some rest, not stressing out too much, working on those test-taking skills tomorrow, right? Okay, I think I'm going to leave it at that. So everybody have a wonderful night. Thank you so much for attending my first live stream of the year. I look forward to doing more of those with you. Okay, so happy to see you all again tomorrow. We'll have our exam and wrap up our ecology unit. I hope you've enjoyed our first unit of the year. I've been enjoying getting to know all of you and look forward to more of that the rest of this year. Okay, take care, and I'm going to sign off. Night-night. You're all welcome. Bye-bye.